Politics is in, I mean, I don't need to state the obvious to you, I think, but politics is now in a state of turbulence, volatility, disarray, unpredictability, the likes of which I don't think we've seen in the post-war period. I can't make sense of someone like Donald Trump. I mean, can anyone make sense of Donald Trump? Did you see yesterday, in the face of that horrid attack in New York, what does the President of the United States do? He addresses, well, he first tweets, but he tells the American nations that the way in which they keep the American public safe is a joke. A joke. I mean, what an extraordinary response from the leader of the free world. Can I make sense of the sort of Brexit fervour, lunacy that has sort of consumed the Conservative Party for so many years? Can I make sense of the Daily Mail? Can I make sense of the kind of what I consider to be sort of deeply old-fashioned, rather aggressive socialism of Jeremy Corbyn? No, I can't make sense of any of that at all. And the kind of moderate politics that I believed in is clearly in abeyance, not only in this country, but across the developed world. So I am a witness to this case. I am someone who has been asked to talk about what's going on in politics, who is in many ways as perplexed as I suspect many of you are. But let me try and get the ball rolling and then invite sort of comments, observations, questions from you by explaining to you how I sort of conceive of some of the changes that are going on. I mean, the first thing to say is a lot of people talk rather breathlessly about sort of paradigm shifts in the economy and society and politics. There's clearly a very significant sort of paradigm shift going on in politics. It isn't just a sort of period of minor temporary turbulence. It isn't just a little bit of a sort of shaking up of the board game of politics before normal business is resumed. Clearly what is going on is more profound than that. And that is important to remember, because I think people still do kind of hanker for a return to the politics with which they were accustomed, to a sort of return to the status quo ante. I don't think that is remotely what is going on. I think it is more profound than that. In other words, we will be moving towards a politics which will look very different to the politics that we are used to. And crucially, the politics of tomorrow will look very different to the politics of today. We are going through a period of transition, of flux, of change, which will settle down eventually. It always does, but it'll settle down to something different to that which preceded it. And I think the tendency in politics is always to assume that somehow normal business will be resumed after a period of sort of abnormal or unusual, unexpected behaviour. I don't believe that to be the case. And in a sense, it's relatively easy to identify why that is the case if you consider where many of us are making here some sweeping assumptions about the average age of this audience. If you consider where most of us have sort of come from in our own personal political journeys. I'm 50 years old, so the politics that I grew up with at the time when my political views were starting to be formed in the 70s and the 80s was, looking back on it, a remarkably simple, fixed, rigid set of polarised choices. You were either for high taxes or low taxes, the bosses, the workers, the north, the south, the private sector, the public sector, the market, the state. And of course, lurking behind that very simple set of choices, right or left, the blue team or the red team, there lurked the great standoff of the Cold War between Soviet communism and Western capitalism. And it was not a world without menace. I remember as a schoolboy in the 70s being absolutely terrible. I remember I had a very peculiar history teacher called Mr. Smith. And I sound so swotty this, but I remember I asked for a special, what 11-year-old asked for special history lessons? But anyway, sadly I did. Second terrible slip of the tongue of the morning. And I remember being so scared rigid by the prospect or the threat of nuclear conflict, which was hung over everything we did in those days as a society, that I asked our history teacher whether he would give us a sort of special lesson. I'll never forget, he sort of marched up to the front of the classroom and got some very old-fashioned cane and pointed at the map of Europe and said, well, the Soviet Union is going to invade Central and Eastern Europe to get to the warm water ports of Southern Europe in the next few months. There will be nuclear conflict. You will be dead by Christmas. And a classroom of 11-year-olds started sort of quietly weeping. And that's the world we occupy. So in other words, it was not a world without menace, but it was a world which was very fixed. It was stable. It was rigid. It was kind of relatively straightforward. You either plumped for one side of that division or the other. And you tended to, if you look at voter behaviour, do what your mum and your dad did and your grandparents, what people did on your street. In other words, the class-based right-left affiliations of British politics, much like the class-based affiliations of politics in large parts of the developed world, were pretty kind of fixed. It is extraordinary to reflect on how politics has changed since then. The fluidity, the volatility is now utterly unrecognisable compared to that political paradigm. And that's why I think it is very foolish to assume that somehow, you no doubt did as well, I read lots of sort of newspaper commentary after the election this year, which said, British politics has restored the familiar kind of pendulum swing of two-party politics. Labour and the Conservatives are completely dominant. Everyone is now once again lined up on either side of that division. We're back, in a sense, we're back to normal behaviour. I think that is a profound misreading of what's going on in British society, and a profound misreading, as I will come to in a minute, for the motives and reasons for why people are voting. There is now far, far greater volatility. There are very high levels of voter abstention. There always has been, and no doubt will always continue to be, almost hysterical levels of pessimism and cynicism about politics and politicians amongst the press and the public at large, but it does appear to have reached a sort of new fever pitch, not, of course, helped by all the sexual scandals that are now coming to light in Westminster. But I think there are some more profound reasons for the move from that old Cold War paradigm to what we inhabit now. First, of course, the end of the Cold War. I mean, I don't know about you, but when people ask me what's the most significant moment in my adult lifetime in politics, I still say it was the collapse of the Cold War. I think the collapse of the Cold War the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was the seminal moment for my generation. I was at the time studying, I was doing a postgraduate degree at the University of Minnesota in it's not a very good accent, in the Midwest of America. And I remember my mother ringing me and saying, turn the television on, turn the radio on, it's extraordinary what's happening. We didn't have a television, my flatmate and I, so I remember we turned the radio on and listened to this astonishing description of citizens of either side of the Berlin Wall, literally taking sort of axes and pitchforks to knock down this symbol of division. And with the collapse of that physical wall, collapsed that whole ideological edifice that I talked about. And you will remember the optimism that abounded at the time. Francis Fukuyama declared history was at an end. Tyranny was at an end. Nuclear conflict was no longer likely ever to happen. Democracy, liberty, freedom, all of these bountiful promises of a better future just seemed possible. I've certainly never lived through a time where the impossible suddenly seemed possible, as was, I thought, really a sort of tangible sense at that time of the Cold War. And I don't think any of us could have predicted that the promise of a better future in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War should have curdled as much as it has done since. And when the history books are written, I think one of the... and I personally believe that in many respects what we're seeing right now is the end of a sort of arc of time from the collapse of the Cold War through to now. It's I think we're finally sort of burying the optimism and sense of a better future, which I think did capture many people's imaginations across the democratic world. So that's one obvious reason. The Berlin Wall collapsed, Soviet communism ended, that great standoff came to an end. But there are other reasons as well. Technology, social media, of course, has had a dramatic effect in the way in which we conduct politics. Some of it's very good, some of it is not great. I mean, I remember not that many years ago now, 8, 9, 10 years ago, people would write about the kind of advent of social media and the ability for people to express their views in the ether, in the internet, in kind of utopian terms, as if suddenly we were going to occupy this kind of democracy in the sky. We were all going to be able to say whatever we liked, everybody was going to listen to each other, there was going to be this great demos in the cloud, and everybody was going to kind of effortlessly and equally and equitably occupy democratic space. Of course, curious enough, again, who could have predicted this, much as we couldn't have predicted how the post-Cold War promise should have curdled. I don't think any of us could have predicted that in many ways social media has allowed us to do exactly the reverse, far from increasing mutual understanding and increasing mutual comprehension across political, ideological, and other divides. It's actually allowed us to create these bubbles, create these balkanized silos where we scream in furious agreement with each other and ludicrously vilify anyone who disagrees with us. And I worry about it terribly, because one of the elixirs of a mature democracy, one of the ingredients of a healthy democracy, because this is at the end what democracy does, is it resolves differences peacefully in plural societies where people don't agree with each other and where everybody accepts that other people, much though you might disagree with them, is entitled to have those views, and that pluralism is the legitimacy of rival and conflicting opinions. Social media, I think, has introduced an almost hysterical intolerance of views with which people do not agree, and that worries me tremendously. Consumerism generally in society has had a knock-on effect on the way in which people conceive of politics. We now have, as consumers, a sort of blizzard of an array of choice, the likes of which no previous generation has ever had. We can, at the press of a button, at the swipe of a screen, command information, corral information for our own purposes, the likes of which no generation ever has done in the history of Homo sapiens. It is an astonishing turn of events, but it's made us all extremely choosy about what we do and don't do as consumers. We are used to the idea of an almost infinite set of choices, certainly as far as the information that we seek to gather to ourselves. And that's feeding through in politics. People now are much, much more volatile, choosy, jumpy, consumerist in their political choices. People will vote one party one election, and another party the next. And a bit like going sort of into a supermarket. You'll sort of pick different parties off from the supermarket shelves depending on circumstance and taste. That is quite new. Politics used to be, in that sense, a much more intergenerationally predictable trade. I think that's, in many ways, a very good thing, because it keeps the politicians on their toes, but it certainly helps explain quite a lot of the volatility. But the biggest single reason, in my view, why politics is taking the very volatile turn of events that it clearly is now, is because of the gravity of what happened in 2008. I'm not pretending to you that I think it's the only reason. As I've described, there are these longer-term historical reasons, there are technological reasons, there are socioeconomic reasons. But it is my view that if the financial implosion had not happened in 2008, I don't think Donald Trump would be president of the United States today. I certainly don't think the British public would have voted for Brexit either. I think it is impossible to exaggerate and overstate the profound and ongoing effect that terrible heart attack in the heart of our financial system has had on society at large. And it was actually brought, anecdotally, so to speak, most sharply to my attention, or at least in the way that I remember it, when I was campaigning for the Remain side in my then constituency, before I was rudely ejected by the voters of Sheffield Hallam, in southwest Sheffield in June of 2016, the run-up to the Brexit referendum. And I played, and didn't seek to play, it would have been entirely inappropriate for me to do so, any national role in that referendum. So I very much focused on, going to schools, doing debates in church halls, standing behind trestle tables and giving out endless leaflets in the referendum campaign. I remember on the Wednesday evening, so the eve of the referendum, I was standing on a street corner with other friends, and we had, Euro balloons and all that kind of paraphernalia, and I was standing in a street corner which we'd selected, as one does in politics, because that's where all the commuters were coming back from work, and was sort of asking people to remember to vote the following morning and so on. And anyway, I met this chap, crossed the road, gave me a very cheery welcome. I knew him. He was a big, burly fellow, great big tattoos on his arm. He was a self-employed builder, and I knew him just because his daughter, he'd come to me 2 or 3 years earlier because his daughter had learning difficulties, and I'd helped her as his local MP and her local MP to get into a local school. So very sort of well disposed towards each other. Hello, Nick, how are you? All the rest of it. I said, oh, very well. How are you going to vote tomorrow? He said, well, Brexit, of course. I said, oh, why are you going to do that? First thing he said, by the way, he said, oh, don't worry, you're going to win anyway, which is, I think many people felt that, and expectations drive voter behaviour much more than is sometimes accounted for. But then he said something to me which has stayed with me ever since. He said to me this, he said, oh, come on, Nick. He said, you can't ask me, you can't expect me to tick a box that says remain, as if everything should remain the same, as if everything is okay, because it isn't okay. He said, I'm working longer hours for less pay. I'm working every hour God gives me. I have less money to spend on my elderly parents, on holidays for my kids, on improvements to my own home. It's not my fault. It's your fault, you wretched politicians who keep telling me everything's better. It's the bankers' fault in the City of London in buildings like this who screwed up. It's the regulators who are asleep at the wheel. And it's ordinary working folk like me who are suffering. And I'm fed up with it. I'm fed up with it. This has gone on for 8 long years that I haven't had a pay rise. I'm not going to tick a box that says everything should remain the same. To hell with it. And I had no answer for him. Of course I could. I could have said, no, don't do that, because if Brexit's only going to make matters worse, and unfortunately already has done, as you probably know. Real incomes were finally starting to exceed the increase in prices in the shops last year for the first time pretty well since 2008, after the longest squeeze on disposable incomes, and it's just flipped back into reverse because of the Brexit-induced inflation. So it's already had a punitive effect on the very people who quite legitimately felt as angry as he did. I could have said that, but that wouldn't have washed. I knew that wouldn't have washed. The heart is a much stronger political organ than the brain. He felt legitimately furious with the status quo, furious with politicians, furious with the bankers, furious with an economic order which was making him and his family hurt for reasons that were he was completely innocent of. And I think it is impossible to exaggerate how widespread and entirely legitimate that feeling is. And it's not the only reason, of course it's not the only reason people voted Brexit. It's not the only reason why lots of voters in the Rust Belt in America voted for Trump. But I tell you, I think it's one of the most powerful reasons and the most legitimate reasons that people should vote against the status quo and should cast around for anyone or anything that seems to provide some succour to their anger, that answers to their frustrations, their sense of disempowerment, and their sense of disenfranchisement from sort of conventional politics. And of course it means that populists do well. Populists always do well. And by the way, just people talk derogatively about populists and populism. They sort of spit out the term. Populism can be a positive thing. Mahatma Gandhi was a populist of sort. He mobilized public rage and discontent against an unfeeling, unrepresentative elite. That's what populism at its best represents. But most of the time, and certainly these days, I think, it's much darker and more negative than that. Because what populists do, whether it's Farage or Trump, whether it's Geert Wilders or Marine Le Pen, whether it's Viktor Orban or Alternative for Deutschland, whether it's right or left, what all populists do, however different they are in any other respect, is firstly, they speak the emotional language of rage, which that man entirely legitimately held, much, much more forcefully than their mainstream competitors. Secondly, they then claim that they have an almost umbilical relationship with the people. What you'll notice about all populists is they talk about the people as a sort of amorphous mass. So Nigel Farage says Brexit is a victory for the little people. Patronising little. Anyway. Trump sort of claims that somehow he doesn't need to listen to the Congress or press or fake news or judges, because he has this sort of almost mythical, spiritual relationship with the people, the mass, the folk. Paul Dacre, the odious editor of the Daily Mail, he invokes the people against saboteurs, against people who, like me, who want to commit treason, apparently. That's what populists do. So first, they explain and articulate rage well. Secondly, that's why they hate parliaments. They hate any checks and balances on their power, because for them, they govern in the name of the people and nobody else. The people, of course, entirely defined as them. And then thirdly, what they always do is they say, and all that rage you feel, you, the people, and I am with you, the people, is their fault. And I've got a simple solution about how to get back at them. So I'll build a wall against the Mexicans and all will be well. Jobs will be restored to the Rust Belt. All we need to do is pull out of the European Union, says Farage, and all will be well. Le Pen says, just kick out the migrants, all will be well. Viktor Orban says, kick out anyone who's a Muslim, all will be well. That's what populists do all the time. And that is why it's dark and nasty and vindictive and false and seductive and vile, and why populism is such a dangerous threat to our democratic way of life. But the point is that man, my tattooed friend, was a good man, a decent man, a lovely man, a devoted father, a wonderful husband, a hard-working pillar, if you like, of his community. I couldn't blame him. And so my final point to you is that whilst, of course, I can't predict what's going to happen this week or even this afternoon in Westminster, I don't know whether there's going to be a great realignment in British politics or not. I personally think, just on that, by the way, because people always ask, so just to anticipate any questions, I mean, all I would say is this, is that, I mean, Westminster is the most woefully sort of clapped out, anachronistic sort of museum of a place. It is wholly unrepresentative in the way it works, the way it thinks, the way it ticks. I tried and completely failed to reform Westminster. I tried to change the way parties were funded. I tried to introduce elections to the House of Lords. I tried to introduce electoral... Anyway, all of it was thwarted, no doubt, because of my own incompetence. But it's extremely resistant to change. Extremely resistant to change, principally because you've got two very powerful vested interests, the Labour and the Conservative parties, who are like vested interests in business. They just keep out any threat, because they've got a wonderful little setup. They've got an electoral system which massively flatters them. They can basically govern with a minority of your vote. They have a wholly untransparent way of hoovering up money from the trade unions on the one hand and the city on the other. They can dump all their friends through this act of outrageous sort of ermine-clad patronage in the House of Lords, no question asked. Of course they like that racket. Of course they do, which is why my attempts as a Lib Dem interloper were constantly thwarted, by the way, not just by the Conservatives, but very aggressively thwarted by Labour as well, much though they choose not to remember that. So Westminster is very impervious to reform. It's about the last place in politics to look for reform. But I intuitively, back to this sort of question I asked myself, whether I think British politics is going to sort of enter into some realignment. Intuitively, I think it is just impossible for any substantial length of time for a parliament to be based on a division of Labour, this old left-right division of Labour, that no longer reflects the ideological fluidity of British society. In many respects, the great division, the fault line in British politics now is no longer really between high tax, low tax, a little bit of extra privatisation or a bit more of the state. It's actually a much more visceral distinction between, are you sort of open towards the world or do you want to close yourself off from the world? Are you comfortable with globalisation? Are you uncomfortable? Are you happy with the pace of change or do you want to retreat from it? These are quite visceral distinctions which aren't reflected in the division of Labour in Westminster. I think eventually they will be. So anyway, I think something will give. I think a dam will break. Can't predict when. But all I can say is that the great tragedy amongst many other tragedies, and this is where I will end, not least because I think this is where you come in, is that what our country desperately needs to answer that man's legitimate anxieties, my builder's friend anxiety on the eve of the Brexit referendum, is not to spend the next several years extricating ourselves from the world's largest and most successful borderless single market. It's not spending all of our time discouraging foreign researchers from coming to our university. It's not further discouraging European nurses to come to work in the NHS. What we desperately need to do is the hard graft of rewiring a deeply damaged and, in many respects, profoundly inequitable socio-economic order in the United Kingdom itself. And as someone who was Deputy Prime Minister for 5 years, who saw how incredibly difficult it is to introduce reforms, particularly, of course, in the teeth of a financial crisis and when you're having to save money and so on, it is not an easy job. And that's why every ounce of political energy should be devoted to the kind of things that we know in the long run make the biggest difference. Quality early years education, quality apprenticeships, housing. We all now know as a country that one of the greatest crimes that has been committed by all politicians of all parties, including mine, in the whole post-war period is that we have willfully refused to build enough new affordable homes for people who legitimately seek those homes. We've done it, by the way, because we have this British obsession with using bricks and mortar as a sort of deposit account. And so people talk about building more homes. The moment you actually advocate it as a politician, everybody first throws up their hands in a NIMBY rage and says, well, not at the end of my garden. And secondly, people say, well, not if you're going to bring down property prices, because that's my nest egg. So we are our own worst enemies when it comes to housing. Some people get terribly holier than thou about it. But everybody, I find, is generally deeply hypocritical on the issue of housing. But we know that if we want to give the young generation who feel legitimately as short-changed as they do, even the vaguest aspiration to be able to get their feet on the first rung of the property ladder in the future, much as their parents and their grandparents did, we need to be building 250, 300,000 new homes every year, year after year after year after year. That, compared to Brexit or North Korea or financial regulation, should be a relatively straightforward, mundane thing that we could manage as a mature economy of 66 million people in the top rank of OECD league tables. Yet we still can't manage that. And that is why, when I do think you come in, because what you can do in your various walks of life, in the various causes that you espouse, in the various services that you try and provide, is to constantly keep people focused on what really matters, what matters to that man, what matters to his elderly parents, what matters to his daughter with the learning disabilities, and to not allow the political and media elite, and I'm afraid they are both as bad as each other, to indulge their own prejudices, fantasies, and preoccupations in a way which pulls away and seeps away and sucks away energy and effort into the things that really would make this country a great country once again. So you've got your work cut out, because you've basically got to keep people looking at the more distant horizon. I'm not going to pretend to you I'm optimistic about British politics. I can't remember a time when politics has felt more bereft of wisdom, of leadership, of selflessness, on all sides, I have to say. I think this kind of loathsome trend towards populism on both right and left will continue. I personally think, my views may not be synonymous with everybody here, but they're well enough known. I think Brexit is by far the worst decision this country has taken since the Suez crisis. And I think it'll shortchange and damage and harm and hurt the very people who, if entirely understandably, voted for it in large numbers on the 23rd of June. So I'm not going to pretend to you that I'm optimistic, but I kind of think we have to be. Thank you very much.